One of the defining features of our world at war is that making sense of most of what is happening requires weaving through all of the complicated interactions in this tangled web of nonsense. Look no further than the current deal slash no deal slash outline of a deal slash concepts of a deal involving Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Lebanon War. But on today's edition of the Geopolitics Helpline, we try our best to untangle ourselves. Why is Iran trying to negotiate over Lebanon with the United States in the first place? Surely they ought to have a separate agreement with Israel on the matter. How would the United States attempting to force compliance by threatening to withhold military aid alter the bargaining dynamics in the Middle East? I think that there is an interesting story here that has not received proper recognition from the broader geopolitics community. It requires broader knowledge of our world at war and an understanding of why bargaining frictions are a necessary ingredient in the recipe for conflict. So rather than jump straight to my answer, let me highlight a couple of points. Then perhaps you can pause for a bit, go enjoy a leisurely walk, think about the issues at hand, and then we can compare notes. The key to making sense of the whole Iran-Lebanon thing is answering two questions. It is not like Israel fighting Hezbollah is anything new. So, 1. Why didn't Iran previously try closing the Strait of Hormuz to exert leverage over the previous situations? And 2. What would happen if Iran tried this again in 5 years, when Israel and Hezbollah hypothetically have another flare-up? If you are ready for some answers, let me start with where we are with the current status of the Strait closure / potential closure / concepts of a reopening. Sorry, this changes on a daily basis, so fill in that part of the script with whatever is appropriate when you watch this. What it is not is predicated on the war in Iran itself. The closure began as a response to the US-Israeli strikes, which were in turn predicated on the perceived short-term weakness of the government in Tehran. Obviously, the parties have had substantive disagreements running between them forever. And while a ton of analysts have cited those tensions as what caused the war, you cannot explain variation with a constant, whereas it is basically impossible to tell a story of why the war began on February 28th without discussing the protests from the months prior. Now, that plan failed. Part of that is a product of taking a gamble. You do not always win. But as I emphasized at the start of the war, part of this is because the whole operation put the cart before the horse. Or do I mean the planes in the air before the boots on the ground? Either way, the airstrikes failed to inspire a proper rebellion. And at least in this case, history's recommendation to not trot out the bombers until there is an organized resistance on the ground was right. As it became increasingly clear that a new phase of protests were not about to happen, the White House began seeking an exit strategy. The critical point here is that wars should end when bargaining frictions cease. So, if the war started because the United States believed that it had a limited opportunity to help incite a rebellion, the war should end when that moment passes, unless another friction takes its place. I suppose technically the kinetic war has ended, but that does indeed feel like a technicality, when the thing that people in the West really care about is oil prices, and the Strait at best could be generously described as clopen. We all know that the hang-up has shifted to the Israel-Lebanon War. Iran's plan here is to leverage the Strait's closure to force the United States to coerce Israel on its behalf, essentially the transitive property of geopolitical leverage. And the White House indeed holds sway here. The United States traditionally accounts for about a sixth of Israeli defense spending during peacetime and a third during wartime. Thus, if the Trump administration wanted to, Israel could be left on its own if it wishes to continue the war in Lebanon. And perhaps that, in turn, would convince Netanyahu to let it go and allow the conflict to be frozen. This would be similar to the strategy that the Carter administration used to build a peace between Egypt and Israel. The offer of substantial arms aid to Israel made it willing to offer its own concessions to Egypt, which got everyone on board. History aside, I think that we all have an instinctual understanding that Iran's current strategy is weird. Well, let me try to explain why it is weird in more concrete terms. Recall that one of the central puzzle questions for today is why Iran had not tried shutting down the Strait of Hormuz over Israel-Lebanon issues before. Just imagine what would have happened a decade ago if Iran had indeed tried this. There would have been universal condemnation of the decision. An international coalition would have quickly formed to convoy ships out of the strait, bomb Iran so that the closure could not be enforced, or both. Today, even though the hang-up on the peace deal no longer has anything to do directly with Strait politics, there is no such consensus. Rather, there is near universal frustration with both sides. And the parties that might ordinarily help the United States here are not inclined to do so now. They would prefer accepting a little bit of economic pain to helping fix a problem that Trump caused by knocking over the first domino. I do not think that the world will maintain its patience forever, but we are still a long way from that changing. Okay, what about the second main puzzle question for today? What would happen if Iran tried this again in 5 years? Well, for one thing, we would have a new president of the United States. And whoever that person may be, Western countries will not find working with the Oval Office as toxic as they do today. Moreover, your average voter in Europe will not tie that future incident to today's ongoing conflict. Do you see where this is going? Iran is leveraging Trump having started the current conflict to extract concessions on a different front. It is an opportunity available only now. And thus we have a standard shifting power commitment problem on our hands. Ironically, the same skeleton of a bargaining problem that led to the war's initiation. Now that we've established why all of this is happening, I have a few comments about whether it will work. The one-sentence answer is maybe, though Iran is facing an uphill battle here. On the US political side, this bears repeating again. American voters are only shouldering a portion of the burden of higher gas prices. Obviously, the current price surge has been enough to generate a wave of anger here, but you could imagine how completely unsustainable this would be if Europe, China, and the rest could somehow push their share of the burden onto the United States. On the US military side, the United States could sustain the blockade along the Strait of Hormuz indefinitely without jeopardizing critical strategic interests. Marco Rubio may get sad that there are not enough assets to invade Cuba, but he will live, and you will not think that this is further handicapping the United States vis-a-vis China. That is the difference between mostly executing police missions versus firing every tomahawk that you have in your inventory. On the Israeli side, you have a prime minister facing a host of domestic legal troubles, charges for bribery, fraud, and corruption. The details here are not critical, just the understanding that Netanyahu benefits from continuing the war because it stalls out his prosecution. Meanwhile, the Israeli public is in a confusing place. They started out enthusiastic about the effort in Lebanon. They have cooled off since then based on the results, even as they remain hawkish on the policy area generally. And they really, really hate where the US-Iran Memorandum of Understanding seems to be heading. Combined, this just seems to be every textbook recipe for war continuation known to mankind. Netanyahu having private leader benefits, Netanyahu also wanting to gamble for resurrection, and Israel generally wanting to use its veto power to undermine an agreement that it does not like. So, on one hand, you have Israel needing to be substantially strong-armed into accepting a deal. On the other hand, you have a US president that seems to be motivated, but not too motivated, to start turning some screws. It may not be an impossible gap to bridge, but it does not inspire confidence. One final, more fundamental point. I am not sure that Iran can lock in any settlement anyway. Shifting power is only worth fighting over if there is some action that I can take now that will secure a sustainable long-run outcome that I prefer more. Here, that would mean leveraging antipathy for Trump into a favorable ceasefire deal for Hezbollah. Okay, suppose that works. Then 1 year passes. Is Israel worried about breaking the treaty? And would the White House immediately go back to providing military aid? The answers to those questions depend entirely on how the international community would respond to Iran's play. And I could see this going one of two ways. Similar to the argument from before, this will be disconnected from the Trump situation. Iran will face significant international pressure, and the Strait strategy will backfire. On the flip side, one of the few things that the actual words on the page of a treaty can do is coordinate expectations regarding what constitutes a violation of the deal. That could, in turn, help shift the blame to Israel and continue the Western indifference toward Iran. I do not envy whoever is working in intelligence trying to figure out which one it will be. Meanwhile, there is only one way that this video can end, with an invitation to keep the helpline going by perusing this playlist. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.